We are the same person that we always have been all through time. It's the strangest phenomenon. Every 7 years, all of the cells in the body replace themselves, right? So every 7 years, we are a new person. Our ideologies change, our dispositions change, like so many things change. So what is it that who I was 20 years ago is still the same person that I am today? We would maybe say that we were a different person, right? But the classical worldview would say that our identification, like as self, the classification of that came about in the beginnings of philosophy have to do with the fact that who we were, who we are, and who we are going to be is the fullness of who we are as a person. It is what gives us the fullness of self. Obviously, the idea of self can be contentious, right? There are all kinds of different ideas, but what Professor Hill says in this book is that it really boils down to three things, and that is that the self is a real thing. It's not like a metaphor, a social construct, but it exists in a very real way. Secondly, that the self is active, so they can make choices, that we as humans are like free to make those choices. And then thirdly, that there is something morally significant about selfhood, personhood, or humanness that makes each human being worthy of special treatment that sets us apart from animals. Those would be like the three core pieces of self that are like fairly universally agreed upon in philosophy, as he explains here. So this first part, right, like the realness of self, it has to do with like unity of its own and persists through time. So like I know Eastern philosophy talks about like our inner child, like our basic self, our conscious self, and our higher self, right? So the basic self is like the inner child. Then you have your conscious self, which is your logic, rationale, and then your higher self, which is like your relationship with religion or like a higher being, something outside of yourself. And so they're like, there aren't plural selves. They're all of the same essence, all of those pieces, the basic self, conscious self, and higher self, or like, you know, the Father, Son, Spirit, like our mind, body, spirit pieces are all, it's not pluralistic, but rather it is still of the same essence of the same person. So he says here, it is to say that there is an integrated foundation underlying the tensions we commonly experience between conflicting reasons, desires, and emotions, like within ourselves. And it is to point to a moral, psychological, and ontological center of gravity in the person, which is what gives us our identity and makes us responsible for our actions. So then the significance of self in regard to action or to be active is that we are the source of our own decisions and actions. Our choices and actions are not just products of stuff outside of us like biology or environment, but rather we choose how it is that we are going to behave. There is nothing, you know, that can force us. You know, there are involuntary actions and voluntary actions, and the fact that we have voluntary choice in our actions that are not involuntary, this is what sets us apart and gives us that it's like a significant piece of self. And then the third piece is that set apartedness of animals from animals, right? It's an ontological divide. It's a difference of kind, not just of complexity. So we have the ability, like animals work based off of instinct, whereas as human beings, we actively can make choices to not follow our instincts, right? Like we can have an inclination and choose to not pursue it, regardless of what that's related to. We aren't subject to our desires, unlike a wild animal. This classical view of self, Professor Hill here says, is the only possible foundation for equality, human dignity, and for the sanctity of human life. And he says these values can be grounded only on what we will call a substantial conception of humanness, a conception fundamentally at odds with a modern functional view of personhood. So substantial conception versus functional view of personhood, which we're going to be getting into in this chapter. He then finalizes this subsection with talking about the differences between like soul and self, how he's going to be referring to those two, because they're not interchangeable in the way that we're going to be dialoguing the next couple days. And so he says the term self will refer to the psychological aspects of human identity and personality, whereas the soul will refer to the metaphysical foundation for the self. So in the coming days, we're basically going to be looking at the relationship of the body and the soul. So like, how is it related, different philosophical views of it, and kind of like find that middle ground, figure out that arc between they are one and the same and they are completely separate, versus how do we find that middle ground of we have our experiences, they are, we are our own person, we are responsible for our actions, and going toward, what does that balance look like? How are they integrated together is what it sounds like. We're going to find out. But tomorrow is the materialist and the Platonic theories of the soul. So we'll see how that goes. Because in my mind, the soul is like the combination of the mind, body, and spirit. Like I see them as integral to themselves, as essences of themselves, that they play off of each other, that our mind and our body are what ultimately bring forth our spirit, which is like our personality. And those are all the pieces that are integrated together. So I'm intrigued to see what these philosophies say, and I hope you'll join me. Enjoy your night.